Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. Hi, I am here with Hanif Abdurraqib. If you have been following me on social media, you've heard me rave about A Little Devil in America, Notes in Praise of Black Performance. Hanif, I just fucking love this book. I just thought it was so, I thought it was so good.
Thank you so much. Thank you for spending time with it. Truly.
Yes. And you know what? I actually asked the Patreon members, you referenced Whitney Houston at the Grammys in 1988. And I noticed that you said that she couldn't dance. And I went back and watched it and I was like, she could dance. She was grooving.
Yeah.
Can Whitney Houston dance? Yeah. Okay.
I think she was like trying her best. She was doing her best. I think also the barometer for what like being able to dance is and isn't shifts for I think she could dance very well for a normal non-pop star person, but I think which I want to be clear, I don't think this, of course, this burden falls on women more than men, but like I don't think if you're a pop star and you can't dance, I think that's fine. I don't know if it's your job to dance, but there's so much pressure, I think, on pop stars to do the whole thing, particularly I think in that era. And so, yeah, I think maybe Whit fell a little bit outside of the realm of great dancing when compared to her peers, but she was doing her best. She was having a good time.
And she was giving a live vocal.
She was, which, I mean, I think that is the more impressive thing.
Yeah. Because
those performances you don't always get that, especially when someone's moving that much. I don't really watch the Grammys these days, but occasionally I'll tap into the performances, and you don't always get a live vocal. And if you do get a live vocal, it doesn't always sound like that.
You absolutely don't. It's so interesting because when I was going back and looking at Whitney's performances through the years, I immediately started thinking of like a Dua Lipa. Like, I don't know if you've seen the discourse around Dua, but like she created this amazing pop, like dance, like funk album. And she's trying really, really hard to do the choreography that should accompany that album. And it's just not quite.
Not clicking. Yeah. She's trying. She does seem like she's trying. But from what I've seen, it isn't clicking, but I hope that it begins to. Because I like the album. I like the album a lot.
I'm a future nostalgia stan. Like, I don't care. Yeah.
I love the album. I mean, for me, like, maybe it's just because of my age or my interest in seeing live things. I don't really need a whole thing live visual thing to accompany an album. I love if it works out that way, it's great. But if you can't pull it off, then I'm fine with this album,
Yeah. I like a spectacle. I'm a pop girl. I like a spectacle. Okay. So I am unabashedly obsessed with pop culture, and I was so freaking impressed by the number of artifacts that you were able to reference, all of these inspirations and historical facts that you're able to pull together and to connect so seamlessly. And this is going to be a real basic question, but like, how do you know so much stuff? Do you take notes? Do you study? Like, I'm really fascinated by that.
I think I'm a curious person by default. And I also think that I'm not like a dangerous skeptic. I think there are people who are dangerously skeptical to the point where they just like don't believe or trust anything or anyone. I don't know if I'm not knocking that. I mean, that's useful in the midst of the American machinery, but I haven't crossed that path yet, but I am a skeptic. And because of that, I never believe that I'm hearing the full story about anyone, particularly about Black folks who have contributed to American culture because of America's insistence on kind of lifting the cultural production from Black people and then leaving the actual whole person behind. And so we don't necessarily get much of their story. We just get a transformation of what they've contributed to the culture. And so I'm just so curious about anyone and anything. I don't assume that what I'm reading or what I've heard is the full story about a Josephine Baker or about a Mary Clayton. The one thing with the research in this book, which wasn't surprising, of course, but there's such a reliance on sketching out particularly Black women as like only tragic figures.
Yeah.
And so I think about someone like Whitney Houston, and I don't want to, it is a tragedy that Whitney Houston is no longer with us, but I don't think she's solely a tragic figure. I think her full life is worth much more than the way it ended. and even the spectacle of people kind of wanting to pick apart how it ended. I think she deserves more than that. I think Josephine Baker deserves more than just having affection heaped on her when she was young and performing feats of athleticism on stages. And I think Mary Clayton is more than just give me shelter, all these things. So so much of my work revolves around kind of mining for the humanity in a person that makes them more interesting than what they produced.
Yeah, you're complicating the narrative. I'm just got finished rereading a book called Glitch Feminism, and in it, Legacy Russell talks about how white supremacy demands that we flatten ourselves. It tries to flatten our stories and reduce us. And I really appreciate that you drew out different parts of the narrative, particularly around Josephine Baker, things that I didn't know. And I feel like I'm a smart person. I know things.
Yeah, I mean, well, to be fair, there were things that, you know, I really like Josephine Baker, and I've studied and researched Josephine Baker for a long time. And I didn't even know she spoke at the March on Washington until like 5 years ago, because the history of the March on Washington has been lensed so heavily through the men who participated. And to be fair, Josephine Baker was like one of the only women who participated via speaking. But her speech is it's one of my favorite things. It's very short, but in that short amount of time, it's funny. It's teeming with rage. It is immensely self-aware. The one thing about Josephine Baker that I think is incredible is just how richly self-aware she was of her place as a Black woman, as a Black American in another country, in other countries, and as a Black American in America. And she used that self-awareness as a tool that was, I think, just immensely smart and useful. But all of it was in service of asking myself, what do I think is most interesting about this person? Because it's probably not what I've heard, or it's probably not what I've most commonly read.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm just going back. I'm thinking about what you just said about how often when we are talking about women, we reduce them to their quote unquote peak of physical beauty and the tragic downfall. Like those are the moments in the lives of women who become public figures that we hone in on, and then everything else just becomes blurred or erased. I think that's really good.
Yeah.
Good point.
I see it, and I mean, I think it still endures. I mean, it still endures now as much as it did when Josephine Baker was prominent. When, for me, actually, Josephine Baker's later career videos, it's the great thing about Josephine Baker is that you can watch 50 years of her. It's just archived online, like YouTube. There's videos from her in 1920, and there's videos of her in the 70s, you know? And I actually think her later career performances are in a way more spectacular. She wasn't as mobile and she wasn't as active on stage, but she was still so commanding.
Yeah.
Because she had learned, I mean, one, I wish more people would talk about Josephine Baker as an athlete, because I think she was immensely athletic, but like so many great athletes, she also learned how to, like when her body could no longer do some of the things that it was able to do when she was younger, she learned how to shift her approach to control an audience in a different way and to awe an audience in a different way that didn't rely on her mobility. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Now this is making me think of Tina Turner.
Yeah.
Did you watch the documentary?
I did, and it was really hard for me. And I'm sure harder for other folks who are not, who are maybe in different margins than I am. But it was hard for me because someone who really loves Tina Turner a lot. And I just think her musical output and her creative output broadly is, I don't know. I just fucking hate that so much of this. Sorry if am I allowed to curse? I don't know if I'm allowed to curse.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just hate that so much of this stuff is still lensed through Ike Turner.
Yeah.
And violence, right? When I just think her output, her solo output, and her influence actually is what I think about. You know, when I think about artists, so I bypass it, but I was supposed to make a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ballot this year, right? I'm someone who was supposed to vote, but because I'd rather like abolish the Rock Hall of Fame, I never vote. But this year I was like, should I vote? Because Tina Turner just deserves it, right? Because the way I think about artists is body of work and influence. And to me, those are the two most important things. Tina Turner has a good body of work, but like her influence, I start thinking about, would Janet Jackson be the Janet Jackson we know and understand, not for Tina Turner, right? And when you're talking about an artistic tree, I just think Tina Turner has a lot of branches that we love and celebrate today. Lady Gaga, you know, like there's people who have pulled from Tina Turner, and that has nothing to do with this. I don't want to downplay the fact that she's a very strong and resilient woman, but she's also more than that too. Yeah. And I think when the narrative gets caught up in only that, it dismisses the actual brilliance of her work and influence that has, that is to me just as a part of her narrative or braided into her narrative, along with her being a survivor.
Yeah, I you know what, I've heard a couple of different people say that, and I think I definitely agree. I think that the going deeper into the aesthetics, going deeper into all of those influences, but like how the comeback like came together musically and those influences, like that is super interesting. Yeah. Okay, so you made me obsessed with Soul Train. I'm obsessed with Soul Train now. I remember when I first read this book, the person I was talking to, I would spend all day like just watching clips of Soul Train, and then I developed a crush on Don Cornelius. And it's just like, what is so freaking compelling about Soul Train, particularly like in the 70s and like early 80s? Soul Train is just, it's the fucking best.
It is, yeah. I'd gotten, a friend of mine sent me a hard drive of every Soul Train episode from 1971 to 1989. And as someone who grew up watching Soul Train reruns in the 90s, this was different because when you're watching a rerun of a show from the 70s and the 90s, you're kind of immersed in it, but then you get a commercial and it's like a Michael Jordan commercial or it's like a Ken Griffey commercial. So you're back in your 90s era. These hard drives, the commercials were intact from the 70s. So there's the Johnson product commercials, the Frederick Douglass Afro Sheen commercial, all that type shit. And so I was really in the world. And I think you're right about particularly that era. I think when it caught a good groove, from like 73 to 84, I think is the era that I'm so, you know, I think before it became like too Hollywood, which that era was still good, don't get me wrong, but it's a different era, no doubt. But there's something about the carefree nature of it. I came up in the 90s, which was in some ways a golden era for Black sitcoms, I think. Maybe that's me being biased, but I think it was. Even ones that have aged or that I don't really give a fuck about anymore, like obviously Cosby shows off the list or whatever. But in that era, you know, before when I was 10 or whatever, that was a hallmark. But also Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, also Living Single, also another one that hasn't aged well for me, but I loved when I was young is Martin. Like these kind of things. It was a real Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, of course. Like this era of Black sitcoms where all I knew was that in order for Black people to be on TV, there had to be a message baked into a laugh track, baked into a family, baked into a kind of not monolithic, but somewhat hegemonic structure. Yeah. And Soul Train for me is so fascinating because there's kind of, its mission is just, we're going to put Black people on television having a good time. And that's it. That's all. You know what I mean? And there's something that I don't think I appreciated about that until I watched it now as an older person, where it's just like, oh, there's no real message here. There's just people dancing. And that's it. You know, songs are playing and people are dancing. And that is it. And that is all. Sometimes, and people who are just genuinely in awe of music and performers. I loved those interview segments where musicians are just like sitting among the audience and there's no like hierarchy. There's no stage to divide them. You just get Marvin Gaye sitting in a circle with people, talking to them like they're his folks because they are.
Yes. These icons that feel so untouchable. They're so accessible in those. I mean, literally, the audience is like touching them, like reaching. Like it's really remarkable. It makes me sad that I wasn't able to put on some coochie cutters and do the Soul Train line in 1974 and flirt with Don Cornelius. Yes.
I know. Watching all those episodes, I was like, gosh, this would be I'm not even a great dancer, but I would go. If I could go, I would go every week.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, on YouTube, they've Soul Train now has a YouTube channel, and they've gone back to interview some of those original Soul Train dancers. And have you seen those videos?
Oh yeah. I love them. And
they like talk about the magic of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the pipeline. There was like a pipeline for some of those folks. I mean, I write about in the book, but you know, Rerun and Jodie Watley and Jeffrey Daniel and like the Shalimar folks and Jermaine Stewart, who's from right out here. He was born on the east side of Columbus, where I live, where I live now. So the Soul Train mind and the Soul Train dancer, of course, Rosie Perez. I mean, there was like a pipeline for talent. Folks who later went on to like choreograph ballets, and it's just incredible.
Yeah, yeah. I love the 70s. Like, I feel deeply that like Black people were just shinier in the 70s. Like there's just like something so particular about that decade for me that I am just endlessly fascinated by. Are there any time periods where you're like, oh, that's it, like I needed to be there?
Yeah, I mean, I am fascinated by 70s, and specifically 1973 to maybe 1977. But I'm also really fascinated, and this is because I was alive but not old enough to really understand what was happening. I'm really fascinated by like 1985 to 1991.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Dude, okay. So back when I was talking to an old Gen Xer, I would force him to have so many conversations about that period. And like, I was obsessed with watching reruns of the Arsenio Hall show.
Yeah.
Like there is something about like when Black people like are first becoming like global supers, like a different kind of fame. Yes, I'm there. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing for me is that, I mean, I was so young. I was born in 1983, so I was too young to really tap into that era. But, it's like the second wave of hip hop as a musical form. Of course, hip hop as a culture, maybe it's in its third wave by then. But as a musical form, I think you get to the like late 80s, early 90s, and it's like second golden era, maybe. And also, yeah, I mean, Black folks were becoming massive, massive superstars.
Yeah.
And for me, the early 90s, when I began to come into cultural consciousness, so much of it revolved around trauma. I mean, one of the first cultural moments I remember is Rodney King beating.
Yeah.
And so subsequently, one of the first real big cultural moments I remember was the LA uprising, right? And that is kind of what informed my first cultural moments. And so I kind of long for having some presence and some cultural memory existing before that one.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I say all the time, this is like, you'll have like random people that you stan. Like if I were to ever meet Arsenio Hall, like I would melt down. I just am obsessed with them. All right. So I wanted to go to something you wrote in the book. You wrote, a people cannot only see themselves suffering, lest they believe themselves only worthy of pain or only celebrated when that pain is overcome. And then later, when you're talking about Green Book, you wrote, if only all movies about Black people struggling against the machinery of this country were instead movies about Black people living. And that reminds me of so many of these conversations that crop up on social media about Black movies and TV shows and why certain stories get made and why we see certain stories over and over again. And I am wondering, how do you explore Black pain and potentially Black trauma and suffering without being exploitative or harmful?
Well, for me, I think in my writing and in my thinking, I always try to counter it with some level of pleasure. There has to be a balance. And for me, I really want the pleasure and the joy to outweigh the trauma. Yeah. There's that piece in the book that's all the ways of looking at blackface. And I was intentional about making it a bit humorous.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to invoke Rachel Dolezal, I'm not going to name her in the book. And I'm going to push her through the lens of all the Black folks I know who were like, that woman ain't Black. You know what I mean? Like all the Black women I knew who were like, her hair looks a mess. All these kind of like these jokes that felt very inside to me. And so for me, it's a question of access. I don't want to explain the pleasures that my people already know. And by withholding those explanations, it's saying to Black folks, I know that you know what I'm getting at, and we can revel in this. We can have some fun here. And that makes it when I traverse the inevitabilities of pain, because this is maybe cynical, but I believe it. I believe that life entails a great deal of suffering.
Yes.
It does. I mean, it's, and to approach deep suffering and to write about actual lives that are immersed in deep suffering is not to do some flash in the pan trauma shit where it's like the blood on the ground is in the shape of Africa kind of thing, not knocking that short film. I don't even know what it's called. I just saw the photo of it online. But like, it's not doing this like aesthetic trauma for the sake of grief or guilt or anything. It's understanding that to be alive for anyone, but because I'm Black, I think about it through this lens. To be alive and Black in this country is to endure deep suffering. Now, that suffering operates on a sliding scale depending on where your margins intersect or where your identities intersect and what margins that places you at. But to approach writing about trauma, for me, is to write about the survival of that deep suffering, which is an optimistic practice. It does more than just say, it's more than just posting the video of someone being murdered or these kind of things. I'm someone who really loves to think about the full life of people, because I hope that whenever my time is up, my full life is taken into account and weighed, and people value that part, that wholeness, no matter how I depart the earth.
Yeah. That you saying that it is an optimistic practice really resonates, because this book does feel optimistic and light, despite the fact that you explore some really painful stuff in your own biography, but also with regard to some of these icons. That's really interesting. And it's interesting to me because I feel like the tone of a lot of our conversations about pop culture is so cynical.
Yeah. Which, I mean, I think I think most either not even critics who are critical of my work in a bad way, but people who read my work is read, or I am read as a pretty cynical person at times. I'm working on that. My therapist would love it if I worked on that a little bit more, but I'm working on it. But I also don't think that, I think that for some folks, I think particularly Black folks, to be cynical is simply to not allow oneself to be a fool. You know what I mean? But there's like a level of cynicism that is, for me, required to not allow myself to be fooled, because I just know better, And so I think that is what I'm operating at, actually. But I do hope, I mean, this book was so fun to write and so exciting to write. And I just was so thrilled writing it. And my hope was that the optimism and joy came through in the reading, because it was such a joyful book to spend time with and spend time in.
Yeah, it was very pleasurable to move through the book. I think a part of that is how melodic the language, how lyrical the language is. I think a part of it is how vulnerable you are in the text. I think I was delighted in seeing how beautifully put together the book is. I was really in awe of the structure. Let's talk about structure.
Yeah.
How does that come together for you? I was really just amazed by how beautifully it is divided in the movements, but how easily you move from talking about an iconic figure in Black pop culture to talking about personal narrative. How does that come together for you?
Well, the structure in the book, this is great because it gives me the opportunity to once again shout out the immensely gifted Maya Millett, who edited the book. Going into the first draft of the book, I knew I was kind of stuck, and I was kind of like, well, I want to seek out my own editor, and I want to seek out a Black editor. And so I put out a call to some friends. It was just like, do y'all know like any Black freelance editors? And universally, everyone was like, you got to find Maya Millett. It was funny because she's you know, it was like I had to put up a bat signal. You know, she wasn't very hard to find, but it was one of those things where everyone was like, you got to find Maya Millet. I'll find it. I'll find an email. I'll find a phone number. And then it was just like all of this mining through how to get in touch with her. When I got in touch with her, I felt like I was like reaching out to the Godfather. You know, it's like I have one favor to ask. But she is the best editor I've ever worked with. And she was kind of like, when she went over the first draft, she was the one who kind of circled some pieces and were like, what you're actually trying to do in the book is this, with the sections on like times I forced myself to dance and the Soul Train piece and all that. She's like, what you're actually trying to do is this. And we got to figure out how to make the entire book do this. And the sections were her idea. The movements were her idea, because her whole thing, you know, I'm pretty great at structuring books, but I really struggled with this one because I couldn't delineate these differences between emotional tone and lines of inquiry that I had built. And she was like, you've already done it. Like, you've already have these sections. You just don't see them yet, but they're already done. You know, the work is done. You just got to be able to envision it. And she laid it out like that. And I was like, yo, the book is telling a story I didn't even know it was telling. Yeah. You know, the minute she provided those movements and then like the subtitles for the movements, and then she said, let's put our heads together and put these in order. It just fell into place. It was like Tetris, you know, it's like everything just fell into place. And so I just owe a great debt to her for that. And in terms of the actual flow of the work, I think that's just how I speak, you know, that's how I speak and think through my ideas, where I'm always trying to, not out of selfishness or not out of ego, but out of a very real understanding that the way I connect to the work and the way I connect to history is by aligning my own history within the larger history of Blackness in America specifically, but globally too. And some of that is just repeatedly understanding that I'm part of a lineage and that I'm not alone in the work. I'm someone who really believes in ancestors, both living and not, both seen and unseen. And there's something about that that humbles me repeatedly.
Yeah. Look, I think that being able to put words together is a real skill, but structure takes it over the top. I think a lot of work falters because it's just the pieces aren't exactly put together in the right way. And you really just found a winning formula here. It was just, I was like in awe, honestly, after I finished it. Such a high degree of difficulty.
Yeah, it did feel, it was a real challenge. And I think the biggest challenge for me is just seeing my work through the eyes of someone else, which I think is, when an editing process is generous, that's what it should be. It shouldn't be someone being like, well, get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this. It should be someone generously seeing the best parts of your work and allowing you to see that through their eyes. And then you have no choice but to rise the level of the work to that highest point. And so when Maya was like, it's funny that the Soul Train piece and the Whitney piece were once the same piece. They were the same essay at one point. And all it took was Maya saying something like, Don Cornelius and Whitney Houston deserve their own space. And here's how we can do it. And that was it, you know? I don't know. I think Maya, or I know, because we talked recently, I know she has like a full-time editing gig at Random House. And so I don't think she's like freelancing anymore. Maybe she is. I don't want to speak for her, but she's the best editor I've ever worked with. And yeah, I hope we can work together again, because this book is not this book without her effort.
Yeah, she deserves all of those flowers. I wanted to talk about DMX. So I've been really interested in how we consume celebrities even after their deaths. I've even thinking about Whitney Houston here. And I'm just wondering, I know that we have, as consumers, we have intimate relationships with celebrities and the stuff that they produced while they were alive. But I've been thinking about, what is the line between celebration and exploitation after an iconic figure like a DMX passes? How do we know when we've crossed it?
It's funny because it's one of those things I always know when I see it, you know? But I don't know how I'd be able to identify it in real-time practice, which is the real trick, right? Because so often I think myself and others I know don't see it till after the fact. And we're like, oh, that made me feel a little gross. Yeah. Or that made me feel like really uncomfortable. I am someone who strives to be very honest about how I felt and feel about a person. And that means that if I have some complicated feelings on a person, I'll probably sit out the public grieving process. It's not required, especially if there are so many voices already immersed in that process. And or I'll limit my grief, right? But that's something I had to learn and become more discerning about, because I am someone who, not very long ago was, if a person died, I was like, I have to share, especially a Black public figure or a musician. I was like, I have to share something on this. I have to get my thoughts on this into the world somehow. And I've pulled back from that because I just don't have something vital or necessary to say about every person who passes. Now, DMX is someone I had a musical relationship with. He's also, to be fair, someone I had to stop listening to as I got older because I struggled with some of his lyrical content, which I think is just a part of, for me, a part of my growing up process and listening process. There are a lot of rappers who I haven't divested from in any way that's like cold or angry, or it's just, I'm a little older and my politics have evolved a little bit, and so there's some DMX stuff I can't listen to. But does that mean that I still think of DMX as someone who was immense? It shaped an era of my life in an immense way. I mean, coming up in the late 90s, being a teenager, being like in my early teens, DMX was like a mythology unto himself, especially living in the Midwest, because, of course, buzz on DMX had been heavy on the East Coast for years and years and years before we got to know him as like It's Dark and Hell is Hot era DMX. But that made the mythology of him in the Midwest, at least in my corner of the Midwest, so richer. And I also can't stress that, like, I can't speak fully to how well it's aged, but It's Dark and Hell is Hot is just one of the great debut albums for me in that era of rap. And more than that, because another way that I've tried to temper my grieving is by being honest about what people gave beyond what they produced for the world. Beyond that, I think DMX had a real gentleness and vulnerability to him that that I cherished, especially as he got older. To witness him getting older was really generous.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about, I so agree with you about, and maybe this is just maturation, but with the police killings that happen, with the deaths that happen, I have been really intentional about saying I don't have anything to add to the discourse. And I do wonder, I've been trying to look inwardly and like, why is that? Why don't I used to have things to say about everything. I used to always want to be the first to say, this is my, and this is, and this is. And now it's like, I feel it deeply because I'm a human, but I don't have a desire to, I don't know what that is.
I mean, for me, there's a sense of humility and understanding that, I live in Columbus, Ohio, which there have been 3 people murdered at the hands of police since December. Just last week, we lost Ma'Khia Bryant. And so much of the work that I do on the ground here is independent of writing or independent of cultural commentary. Yeah. And so one thing is humbling myself and realizing that there's a level of work that I'm taking to, that this city deserves me to take to, that doesn't require me being very public or loud. But also, I'm immensely aware that there are a lot of people who are better at articulating things than I am. Right. And to add to the noise, even though I think I'm equipped to say things, especially now, but there's some ways where to add to the noise with, especially with my mode of communication, which is sometimes sarcastic or sometimes cynical, I think that sometimes drains energy from other folks. But I also think very plainly that by now, anyone who has been in my orbit at least for any amount of time just knows where I stand on things, because I try to make that clear, both in my work and in very, very much in my actions. And so, I think I need less to, as I get a little older, I don't really need to plant that flag in the ground at every corner as much, because people just know, people see the work.
Yeah. You write in this book about your own grief, I think very tenderly and very vulnerably. I, as somebody who's a professional oversharer, understand that when you talk about really painful parts of your life, then people are drawn to that, and then they want to engage you about the most painful shit you've ever experienced but decided to share in public all the time.
Yeah.
And even like the most inopportune moments. It's like, I'm just trying to listen to Brittany. Like, I actually don't want to talk about my father's death right now. I wonder if that ever happens to you, if you get caught off guard by the way that people want to engage you about the pain that you've experienced.
Yes, but I also have a lot of grace and a lot of patience for that, in part because I have lost a lot of people I love in my life, and I have been immersed in grief for much of my life, I think, because I don't believe in grief as something one puts down. I think it's something I just carry with me, and it evolves through the carrying, it evolves. And so, not that I owe anyone anything, but I do believe that I have siblings in grief all over the world. I have siblings in grief who are grieving now or have grieved before, and might want to reach out and talk about that immense bridge of grieving that we are both attempting to traverse. And I have a lot of patience and a lot of grace for that. Does this mean that like I'm always down to just talk to anyone about? No, but I try to make myself pretty accessible. My website has an email form that still goes directly to me, which I think a lot of my friends who are also writers with some level of visibility are also creators with some level of visibility. They're always like, how is that? Why do you do that? But I don't want to shut myself off from people, because so much of why I write is to connect with people. So much of why I create things is to connect with people, because I've felt for so long like I was an individual with no country, no emotional country. And my sense is that my work sometimes helps other people's emotional landscapes come into view a bit clearer. And I don't want to shut myself off from those interactions. I really value them. And do they catch me off guard? Do they get exhausting from time to time? Of course. But that's, I just try to have some grace, at least for now. There might become a point in my life where I'm like, I can't handle this anymore. But I think for as long as I can emotionally handle it, I try to have grace.
Yeah. I want to talk about the connection between consumption and love. You wrote, the thing I find myself explaining most vigorously to people these days is that consumption and love are not equal parts of the same machine. Mm-hmm. That is okay. To consume is not to love. And ideally, love is not rooted solely in consumption. That shit hit me so hard. In there, I think you're talking about the mainstream's relationship to Black culture. But because of capitalism, we are often taught to consume each other, to get as much as we can get from each other, to extract as much as possible in our interpersonal relationships. And so I'm wondering, how do you unlearn that?
I've unlearned it, I am in the process of forever unlearning it, I think, by being a party to and a witness to and someone who engages in practices is seeing what actual deep reciprocal love feels like and looks like. But I'll say this particularly, I write about this in the book, but particularly among other straight cis men who, like, in my younger 20s, I think I was so confused by how to love the other men in my life because of the trappings of quote unquote traditional masculinity, right? But just getting older and kind of tearing down these walls that are self-made, at least for me, were like entirely self-made. So it wasn't even tearing down, I was just kind of like nudging them and watching them disappear, and getting access to just real, tangible, reciprocal love in actual relationships, which means for me a love that has nothing to do with what I'm producing or how I'm producing work, that allows me to step out in the world differently.
Yeah.
And I see it in so many ways. I see it in a way where I'm just not as demanding of artists as I used to be. I used to be like, when is this album coming out? When is this album? You know, I thought I was listening to you listen to Kalela at all?
Mm-hmm.
Love. I mean, I'm still rocking with her last album. And I found myself like, gosh, you know, I would love a new album. But also, you know, where years ago I'd have been like, I would love a new album. Where is it? Like it's been 3 years or 4 years or whatever. Where's the new album? Now I'm kind of like, I would love a new album from her, but if it never comes, I have such gratitude for this album that's out, that's in the world. I'm so thankful that I get to listen to this and have it, you know, and carry it with me. I don't necessarily need a new thing. I'll take one with immense gratitude. I'll take one. But if another one never comes, how great that I have this. And I think that is also unlearning. It's thinking about consumption in a more generous way and realizing, detaching my ego from it too, and realizing that I'm not owed anything from anyone.
Yeah.
In interpersonal relationships, but also in artist and listener or reader or viewer relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that way about Rihanna. I feel like Rihanna was the soundtrack to my coming of age. And now it's just fun to see her having fun. It's just fun to see her enjoying life.
Also, I don't love every Rihanna album, although I like a lot of them. But I love that last album so much that if that's it, like honestly,
yeah,
I think that's the point that I get to with so many artists where Sleater-Kinney is a band I love more than most bands. They're, I think, one of the best bands in American rock music history. I didn't love their last album that much at all, but I was also like, so what? They gave me like 5 great albums in a row, like 3 classics and 5, you know, like I don't really need much else. And so I think thinking about the work like that has also made me a more generous steward of my own work and someone who is more generous to myself when I think about what I can and cannot do production wise.
Yeah. Yeah. That point about being generous with yourself, being generous with other people, being a pathway to being more generous with yourself. I think that that's also really it, because I think that I, as a person who makes things, I feel enormous pressure to like make things. And is it better? Is it the best? Is it this? Is it that? And like, I project that outward, but like, I'm cool. Like I have a body of work and it's fine. I still want to make things, but I'm not putting the same pressure. Yeah.
Yeah. Anytime I think, I want to say this for Black creators especially, but anytime we can avoid the trappings of self-made pressure, I think we're doing ourselves a real service, because there's a pressure in the world beyond ourselves that we have to answer for.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the devil be working overtime, so we shouldn't be on the clock. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, especially once you get a certain amount of financial stability, right? Like, so I understood when I was like, oh shit, how am I going to pay these student loans? Like, I have to produce. But once that's no longer a factor, frankly, then I feel much more comfortable being like, okay, I can breathe. Yeah. Like I'll take some rest.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and rest is I've been nonstop since January with the book, and I'm looking forward to May because it's the first month that I'll have ability to rest. And I don't know. I mean, I grew up in a house with 2 hardworking parents, and when my mom passed, I feel like my dad worked. My dad just worked so hard, and not just at his job, but worked to parent. You know, one thing I take for granted that I definitely took for granted when I was a kid was that my dad just like never missed anything.
Yeah.
You know, single parent when I was in high school, my dad never missed a sporting event. Me and my brother were playing sports. My dad never missed a sporting event, never missed a play. I was in plays and never missed a play, never missed anything. Which, like, now that I'm older and have responsibilities and like have work days that I get to the end of, I'm like, holy shit. You know what I mean? Like, my man was working like 9-hour days, and then like even when I had a car and could drive myself home from the soccer games, was still coming to the games. I just can't wrap my head around it, you know? And so I came up with a parent who just worked really hard.
Yeah.
and thankfully is still alive and is resting now. But I think I am thankful for opportunities to rest in real time and to kind of pepper the work with rest, to season my working with rest. I would like to rest more frequently, but I'm working on it, I guess.
This brings me to another thing, Hanif, because you've written a lot of books, like in a very short amount of time. And I've for years wondered, how are you so productive? How are you keeping up the momentum of this much output?
Oh, it's funny because to me, it just, I know that numbers wise, it seems like a lot. I guess, when did Crown come out? Crown came out in 2016. So it's like 5 books in 5 years. But, realistically, I started writing The Crown at Worth Much in 2014. So it's more like, 5 books in 8 years or whatever. But one, they're books in different genres. And I think a poetry book kind of spreads out for me in a different way. Fortune Fairy Disaster took a longer time to write. And I'm a person who's like consistently excited and enjoys the pursuit of my excitements, even if I'm not writing towards a book. But I oftentimes have something that I just can't wait to show people. And it just so happens that comes out in book form. I'm also maybe just trying to write as many books as it'll take for me to just retire at an early age and never have to write a thing again, but become reclusive. I think I'm a recluse at heart. I've been everything but reclusive in the past, especially 3 years. But I think at heart, I'm a reclusive dude, who just kind of wants to live in Ohio with my dog and play video games. I'm like I think a thing that's real about me that people maybe don't realize it, because I do think that I am vulnerable, and through that vulnerability, some personal things seep in, but I'm a pretty private person, ultimately. And I think I'm angling towards being reclusive. So maybe if I write 10 books, I can just live in reclusive cabin for the rest of my days.
Yeah. Okay. I want that for you. Yeah. So something that many people, I think in Gen Y, millennials, a lot of millennials are pushing back on is this idea that Black excellence has to mean singularity. I really appreciate that in this book you explore the excellence that is found in the quotidian. And it's interesting that you juxtapose those singular, iconic figures with your own very normal life experiences. I assume that that's intentional.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, my father, the thing I just described about my father is Black excellence, right?
Yeah.
That level of endurance and support for one's children through grief as well. I mean, my father also lost his partner. I mean, that's excellence, right? And that is not mundane to me. It's a very real palpable level of Black excellence. And to me, it's not a monolithic idea that I think breaking from a monolith and saying that the ways I see Black folks performing excellence takes on so many different forms in so many different modes that feel to me just as worthy of uplift, or if not more so, right? The so-called mundanity of Black excellence deserves exuberant uplift. And I'm also aware that for all those stories that everyone knows, there are many, many more stories that folks don't, like Ellen Armstrong. So excited to find the story of Ellen Armstrong and uplifted in the book, because I think she was a Black miracle worker who deserves immense praise.
Yeah, Ellen Armstrong was the Black woman magician.
Yeah, the first Black woman magician to headline her own show.
Yeah. That's a story that I would never come across. Yes.
It's funny because there was a point in the cultural discourse where the phrase Black girl magic had become somewhat commodified, or extremely commodified, and all these response pieces started to come out, and we're kind of talking about how, like, the pitfalls of defining Black women as magical, which I understood a lot of those. It wasn't really my place to have like a take, but it sparked something in my brain where I was like, I dig these pieces and understand where they're coming from, but I'm also kind of, now they've sparked my interest in wondering who the first magical Black woman was, And I just kind of went on I just weirdly Googled, like, who was the first Black woman magician? And I found out about John Hartford Armstrong and then Ellen Armstrong. And I just found her work and her story so miraculous, and how eagerly she performed miracles for her people in churches, in barns, in places where Black people live down the coastal South. I just, those kind of Black miracle workers are the stories that I'm interested in.
Yeah. Along the lines of like celebrating normality, it struck me that the subtitle of this book is Notes in Praise of Black Performance. And you do talk about the big iconic performers like a Whitney or Josephine Baker. But we're all performing every day, all the time. And I wonder if that's intentional, right? Like to connect the larger with like the daily stuff that we do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because so much of this book was me trying to shake free my preconceived notions and whatever shame I felt around the word performative or performativity itself. Because, it's a term of derision often, or used to deride someone for often online behavior. But I think there are ways that, our nature is performative just in our daily, day-to-day movements, right?
Yeah. And those performances connect us. We're connected by those performances.
Right. I mean, sometimes, I live alone except for my dog, and sometimes I have to perform for my dog to get her to do stuff I don't want her to do, she like scratched her nose, and a while back, and I had to like nightly put this ointment on her nose and get her to not lick it off. And in order to get her to not lick it off, I used to have to like dance around the house with her in a toy, which is a level of performance, right? So there are ways that performances connect us. They enhance our potential to survive, depending on where we are in the world. The way that I know how to live / behave / move in certain corners of even Ohio is a certain level of performance that's rooted in my desire to control my own potential for survival. And so I don't necessarily want to only feel like performativity is something that should be derided.
Yeah. I think knowing how to do the right performance is a good thing. It's admirable. It shows that you're connected. It shows that you have a desire to. I agree. Yeah.
I
want to end on discussing cultural criticism. Do you consider yourself to be a cultural critic?
I guess I do, because that's what everyone says I am. I don't ever think about it, but I suppose I am, because I am someone who's immersed in culture and therefore feels like I comment on it often. And so I suppose I'm a cultural critic.
Is there something, what animates the hesitancy to adopt the label?
Well, because I think that criticism is so often painted as something that isn't forged out of pleasure, or in a relationship of pleasure. And so much of my relationship with criticism is born out of pleasure, and it's born out of excitement, and born out of immense joy, and not necessarily an impulse to be correct, or an impulse to say the right thing, or be atop, stand on the mountaintop and say I was right about something.
Yeah.
And but sure, I suppose I'm a cultural critic, because that is what most commonly said about me.
Oh, I love that you took it there, because I was thinking about, or I'm consistently thinking about, how so much of cultural criticism, or the stuff that gets the most airtime, is about either deconstruction or standing on top of the hill and making the grand pronouncements. And this was so exploratory. It was so much about joy and just like taking time with these artists, but also taking time with your own memories. I think that's what stuck out for me about this book.
Yeah. There's a patience, right?
Yeah.
I just don't want to respond to everything in real time. I used to have to, you know, but I like having that option off the table if I want off the table. I don't always want to respond to everything in real time. I want to let things marinate. I want to see how I feel about things and how I fit into that feeling and all this stuff. And that feels important to me. And it feels like that is the most worthwhile pursuit I can offer.
Yeah. Well, that is all I have. Thank you so much, Hanif. I just freaking, again, love this book, have recommended it to so many people, just think that it is a monumental achievement. You and Maya just did a thing. Y'all did a thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.